The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with, even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept, and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. And that is what we're about in this sesshin, and for that matter, in our whole life, is realizing the true. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to do that. But it's possible. And we are already starting the work. We've been starting the work for a while, given how much time all of you have been doing practice. I don't think there are any actual beginners here, although in another sense, we're all beginners. Every day, fresh day. Every mind, fresh mind. So today is the first day of this November 2020 COVID-19 Zoom sesshin here at Mountain Gate. And it's wonderful to see all of you here joining together like this, even though we're in very different locations. Some of you on the East Coast, some of you on the West Coast, some of you closer at hand. It is truly heartening to see how many people are here, joining in, combining our energies to come to liberation for the benefit of all beings. In the opening ceremony of this sesshin, I spoke of the vital importance of what Torei Enji called the long maturation. It's not something that was really talked about, particularly not in the earlier decades of Zen practice in the West. And I'm not sure how much it is actually talked about even now, other than with some significant people who are both doing Zazen and are clinically trained. John Wellwood, who's a clinical psychologist, and Mark Epstein, who's a psychiatrist. Both of those people and others in their fields have emphasized how important it is, and we've had way too many examples of people who didn't really follow through in their practice. In order to be truly liberated, it's not enough just to come to awakening at some level, not just enough to have had a satori, or even 2 or 3 or 5. It's about ongoing work that the satori, the insights, the kenshos allow us to accomplish if we take up that banner. Some examples from history. And here I'm going to share with you from the discourse on the inexhaustible lamp, which is an excellent, excellent book. It's these are the words of Torei Enji, who was Hakuin's first Dharma successor and a phenomenal human being. He started practicing when he was 8 and never let up, and continued to have deeper and deeper and deeper openings into the nature of mind. That's what Kensho is, really. It's seeing into the nature of mind, the true nature of mind, as opposed to being blindsided by our attachments and our dysfunction that comes out of the attachments. Torei, by the time he reached Hakuin, when he was something like 21, had already had a Kensho experience. And his teacher at the time suggested that he go and train with Hakuin, and so he did. And then when he was about 26, 27 years old, he got quite ill. He had, shortly before that, done an extreme ascetic retreat on his own in the mountains outside of Kyoto, I believe it was, when his mother had died. It was to, I don't know whether it was to offer up his own zazen, his own efforts to help her process in terms of whatever was going to happen to her after death, or what. It doesn't really say, other than the fact that he laid caution to the winds and did extreme levels of practice with very, very little food. And as any of you who have been there know, Japan is a very damp place. It's an island or a series of islands, and dampness is endemic there. In fact, every year when it begins to get colder, green fuzz grows on anything, pretty much. It's not quite as bad as Rangoon, where I also lived, where even the cows got moldy. Their skin got moldy, their fur got moldy, because there was so much rain there. There's not quite so much rain in Japan, but it's surrounded by water. And there's many waters, rivers and lakes and so on within the country as well. And so it's quite damp. And in the winter, it's very cold and quite damp. And in those days, and for many generations, there was a vast amount of tuberculosis among the people there. And there's a good possibility that that's what happened to Torei, that he got TB. At any rate, the doctors gave up on him. And so he decided, well, if I'm going to die, I will write down what I understand about Zen practice. Maybe it can be of use to someone. And so for about 6 months, he alternately slept and wrote. And by the end of that time, he had actually recovered. Right about that time, Hakuin sent a letter asking him to come and visit. And so he did, and he took this treatise along with him and offered it to Hakuin and said, if this is of any use, do what you want with it. But if it's not, if you feel like it's not helpful, then please destroy it, burn it. Well, obviously Hakuin felt it was worthwhile, and so we can read from it nowadays, thanks to a couple of different translations. This particular one is by Zen Center London, or published by Zen Center London, and was translated by its Zen master, Myokyo-ni, a woman who got transmission from Morinaga Soko-roshi, who was a Rinzai master in Japan. This is quite a long time ago at this point. Morinaga Soko-roshi's been dead for, a good number of years. Not that long, because I did sit with this group in 1992, briefly, on visiting Kyoto. But I think it was 1996 he died, 1996 or 97. And Myokyo-ni was a woman, which was rather unique in that era. She trained at, I believe it was Daitokuji, Rinzai Temple in Japan, Rinzai Headquarter Temple in Japan. And she was assisted by a Japanese woman whose name is, Yoko Okuda, who apparently was a student there in London. It's an excellent book, and I would strongly suggest that you try to get a hold of it. It's still available through Zen Center London for not a whole amount of money. I think somewhere around $40. And it's well worth it, because not only does it have the translation of Torei Enji's words, but it also has a commentary on his words by a then contemporary Zen master, Daibi, who was alive and teaching in the 1930s, I think it was, in Japan, and has extensive commentary, which is very helpful because it gives a lot of background information and so on. There's a more recent translation by one of the Cleary brothers, and that one is easily available on Amazon.com, but it does not contain Daibi's commentary. So Torei was a strong proponent of what he called the long maturation. He felt that practice involved beginning practice, continuing practice. Then after one had had a kensho, something called advanced practice, where one took up the koans, the subsequent koans, and worked with them to continue to deeply and more broadly understand the nature of mind and open to it. And at the same time, he felt that this long maturation was absolutely vital, and it is. We've had a number of examples in America of both foreign Zen teachers and Tibetan teachers too, for that matter, as well as American Zen teachers who hadn't done that vital work, and as a consequence, created a huge amount of pain and suffering among many of their students. Two of the most prominent ones, Japanese, are now deceased, but they went to their graves continuing to deny their negative behavior, which is rather sad. It is important, and this is something that Mark Epstein also stated. And in fact, there's a book that I will share to you from called Advice Not Given, in which he takes the Eightfold Noble Path and speaks to it, each of the steps on it that help one develop a fully rounded, enlightened personality with enlightened behavior. There's another book that came out much earlier, which is by Jack Kornfield, the Vipassana teacher, called After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. And it's a very apt title. Jack Kornfield spent 5 years as a forest monk in Thailand. And by the time he had reached the 5-year point, he felt like he had gone pretty far in his practice. And then he returned to the States, to New York City, and reality struck. He discovered that he had not done a lot of work that he felt was essential. And in order to help with that, he actually went back to school and became a clinical psychologist. And he's now one of the founders of a couple of different major Vipassana centers in the United States. After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. We have a kensho experience, and suddenly we feel free. It's as if a lot of inhibitions have been dropped, and I believe that is actually true. We're no longer as imprisoned by our self-image, our ideas of things, but that can go a little bit wacky. And it's important to really take to heart these admonitions by Torei, by John Wellwood, by Jack Kornfield, and many others, Mark Epstein and so on, to really now get to work, because kensho allows us to see where we're caught. Not 100%, but it's an opening of a window in the mind, and we begin to see where we are caught in greed, anger, and delusion that we weren't even recognizing before. So let me share a few things, a few stories. And this is starting with the treatise on the inexhaustible lamp of Zen. In the section on long maturation, Torei has brought forth the stories of many of the old Zen masters, starting in early China and continuing into Japan. And of course, Daibi has commented as well. One of those Chinese masters, the pronunciation in Japanese of his name is Jimyo. And Jimyo, you may have heard of, because he was famous for being so committed to his practice that when he felt like he was drifting off into sleep doing yaza, he would take a gimlet. And I don't know if you all know what a gimlet is, but it's a very sharp pointed tool that was originally used to drill holes, to make holes in things. And he would stab himself in the thigh to kind of wake himself up. Decades later, more than decades, hundreds of years later, Hakuin himself had gotten extremely discouraged in his Zen practice. Hakuin had come to Zen practice because he had gotten the impression that it would save him from falling into hell. He was a regular boy growing up in Japan and did things that he later realized were maybe not so kind, like using a slingshot to kill crows and things like that. And then he also had an older brother, and his older brother had saved money to buy a scroll. And Hakuin, the kid, had a little set of bow and arrows, and he was shooting it inside his house, which is probably forbidden because in those days, those traditional houses were, the partitions, the walls were of paper. And so he shot his little arrow, and it went through the wall and right through the eye of one of the figures on his brother's scroll. So he did various things like that, and boy things, kid things. And yet he was also somehow convinced, I think it was because his mother took him to a talk by a non-Zen but Buddhist priest who was proclaiming the terrors of hell. And then he was in the Japanese bath, and the servant had heated it up a little bit more than necessary, and so it was bubbling. And that reminded 10-year-old Hakuin of the terrors of hell, the boiling hell. And so he just freaked out. And at a certain point, he had figured out that if he became a Zen monk, he would be able to avoid the horrors of hell. And that was his motivation for joining practice. And it took him till he was 14 to convince his parents to let him ordain, even though his uncle was a Buddhist priest. And so he did. And then much later, when he was about 19, he heard the story of Ganto, who was a deeply realized Chinese monk who was murdered by bandits. And the story goes that as he was being skewered with a sword, he screamed so loud that it was heard 3 miles away. And all of a sudden, young Hakuin thought, oh, shit. So much for my relief from falling into hell. And he got quite discouraged. Eventually, he actually quit practice for a while and apprenticed himself to a master calligrapher, which was beneficial to our end in the end, because he became a prolific artist and calligrapher with an amazing variety of styles. But after some months of apprenticeship, he realized that he probably was not going to make it as a calligrapher. And so he was casting about for what else he could do with his life. And he happened to be in a temple courtyard where they were airing the books. And every year, twice a year in Japan, because it is so damp, all the books are brought out into the sun on a sunny day and opened up so they can dry out and not get moldy. And then there are also some things that are sprinkled among the pages to keep the bugs from eating the books. And so he decided that he needed some kind of omen that would tell him which direction to go in his life. And so he walked up to one of the books, closed his eyes, took his finger and put it down at a particular point in one of the books. And it's interesting because they talk about books, but I'm not sure it was a book like we know books. I think it might have been more a scroll. And then he opened his eyes to see what it was. And this was the story of Jimyo being so dedicated to practice that he actually kept stabbing his thigh with his gimlet so that he could stay awake and keep working. And that inspired Hakuin to go back to Zen practice, to our great benefit. But let's read further on. Torei is talking here and says, the national teacher Daito received the old patriarch's deep and profound order to spend 20 years in cultivating the holy womb. Thus he came to full maturity and manifested the far-reaching supreme virtue strength of Daiho, who was his teacher, and Daiho was a Chinese master, actually, came from China. This is an example of the long maturation. Daiho said, okay, you've realized deeply, but now you need to put it into life. And so Daito went for 20 years. Let's read what Daibi has to say about that. National teacher Daito, or Shuho Myocho, inherited the Dharma from national teacher Daiho. He founded the Daitokuji temple in Murasaki, the Purple Fields, northeast of Kyoto. The title national teacher Daito, which translates as Great Lamp, was given him by the retired Emperor Hanazono. Emperor Go-Daigo also was an ardent disciple of his. Our Zen school was brought to Japan during the Kamakura period and prospered until the Ashikaga period. Some 24 lines of it extended at the time, owing to the emergence of distinguished teachers of great character and cultivation, whose teachings took on distinct characteristics and so became branch lines. But as time went on, most of them had no errors and so died out. Today, there are but 2 lines left, that of Master Dogen, who had brought the Soto teachings to Japan, and our Rinzai school of the line of national teacher Daiho. I'm not in a position to know how or whether the Soto school has handed down their correct line to this day, and therefore I'm not qualified to comment on it. However, the one line of Yogi was brought to Japan by the natural teacher Daiho, where it was followed by such distinguished heirs as Daito and Kanzan, who successively passed on the Dharma, till it finally reached Master Hakuin in an unbroken line. From then on, it has continued down to this day. For this reason, the distinguished achievement of these 3 national teachers, Daiho, Daito, and Kanzan, are considered outstanding, not only as seen from the Zen school development, but also for their influence on the culture of Japan. When he was 26, Master Daito penetrated to the depth of the teaching under the national teacher Daiho, who confirmed the transmission by a poem. You have already cast off the light and mingled with the darkness. I do not match you, but you, our school will be brought through, by you, our school will be brought to flourish. But for some 20 years, you need to undergo maturation. So right there, he's saying, okay, you're deeply realized, but you have to bring it to life in your daily life. After that, you should make known this confirmation to others. ... Received the old patriarch's deep and profound order, etc., is quoted from Kanzan's admonition. Natural teacher Daito, obeying his master's orders, gave himself to the long maturation, during which he lived for a time among the beggars under the 5th bridge in Kyoto. As to, quote, deep and profound, close quote, deep means to reach to the very depth and to sink into it, indicating the long maturation, and profoundly expresses the utter purity of the way. From Daito later emerged the shining light of his painful practice, manifested itself in his far-reaching and supreme virtue strength. Accordingly, the Dharma line could be handed down unbroken through the generations. And then Kanzan. Torei here is talking, having attained to the marrow of the way under Daito, national teacher Kanzan went into retreat in the remote Mino Mountains, where for many years he practiced diligently. He spent his days working for farmers and meditated by night. And Daibi comments, national teacher Kanzan was Daito's Dharma heir, though in actual years of age he was older than his master. However, with regard to the way, difference in age is of no importance. After Kanzan had attained the marrow of the way, he at once left and withdrew to the remote mountains of Mino, where he nurtured the long maturation. It is said that he hired himself out as a laborer to the farmers there. None knew he was a man of supreme virtue. Doing odd jobs by day, such as tending cattle or working in the fields, he used to meditate by night. He had lived that way for some 7 years when the cloistered Emperor Hanazono heard of him and summoned him to the capital. Though the examples cited by Torei are of outstanding masters, actually the same applies to all the other successive patriarchs as well. Having attained to the way, they went into retreat, effacing themselves on only walking the way in diligent practice, maturing. The extent of their endurance of hardships and of their bone-breaking practice is matchless and beyond common understanding. And of course, how we practice after that deepening is vital. And here I'd like to share from Mark Epstein, giving you a psychiatric perspective out of this book, Advice Not Given, A Guide to Getting Over Yourself. Guide to Getting Over Yourself. Right motivation suggests that we do not have to be at the mercy of our neuroses if we do not want to be. The conscious mind, when properly oriented, can, with practice, rise above the conditioning of its subconscious influences and intentionally direct a person's activity. More often than not, as therapists know all too well, we are run by impulses we cannot see. Our conditioning, how we grow up, how our childhood was, all of this impacts our assumptions about ourselves and our view of the world. For example, if a child has experienced what are known as adverse childhood experiences, where the caregiver has been absent or been inconsistent in their care for the child, then the child develops an assumption that life is not safe, that they can't trust. And so as they grow older, they act out of that assumption, and that creates pain and suffering. It's known that something like 90% of kids that end up in the juvenile protection system, in detention, or arrested have had those kinds of experiences. And it is that misunderstanding that they developed through their early childhood experiences that causes them to act in ways that are not positive in terms of society. I would suggest that many, if not most of us, who are studying Zen practice have had some similar types of experience where we may have had some insecurities develop and compensate for them through behavior that might not be optimal. And here's the thing. As we do our practice, we begin to recognize, we begin to see, experience insights into how we behave, insights into our motivation. And there is this incredible opportunity to become free of those, as a good friend of mine calls them, caught places. And it's vital, because as long as we stay caught in those caught places, we act out of them unwittingly, and the result usually is some level of suffering for ourselves and for others. It creates an atmosphere of dysfunction, and we try to compensate the best we can to be safe, to be loved, to be recognized, and we don't realize that we're doing this out of assumptions that we developed as young children based on how people interacted with us in those days. And yet there is a way out. There truly is, and we can become free of that conditioning, and we can develop into the people that we really are born as, perfect, whole, and complete, naturally endowed with compassion and wisdom. Let's see one more thing. We can shake free of our unconscious influence if we first admit that they are there. And that's the hard part. And that's why there have been examples in the past of people who supposedly had deep awakening experiences. They overrode those insights. They ignored them. They shoved them into the back corner. When we see where we have behaved in a less than optimal way, and we allow ourselves to feel the remorse, the regret, the pain, in other words, to own it, then there's this incredible possibility of moving into a more enlightened way of being and offering less trauma and more compassion, wisdom, support, love, caring into the world. It's our choice, but it's vital. And Zen practice is an incredible tool through which to accomplish this. So as we continue our practice, let's not ignore what we may uncover. Of course, we're all seeking liberation. But liberation also involves not just the joy of seeing the truth, but also the activation of living the truth. This is our responsibility and our privilege, and a way we can offer ongoing wisdom and compassion into life and support an enlightened way of being. So that's how we go about it. To see where we're caught and not to override it, but take it to heart and work to let it go. One of the wonderful things that does happen to help this along is that when we do see where we're caught and we choose to own it, we choose to offer it radical acceptance. Well, I'm not really happy about seeing this behavior pattern in myself, but okay, I'll take a big gulp and recognize that, all right, that's how it is right now, but I don't have to stay with it. Then the next time the impetus to act in that same way rises, it's almost as if a blinking light, a stop sign comes up and says, wait a minute, do you really want to do that again? You know how it creates suffering, and it's easy not to do it. But the key is to allow ourselves to open to the discomfort of witnessing our less than optimal behavior so that we can be let go of it, so we don't continue it, so we live in a more free and compassionate way. That is the purpose of Zazen. We have these marvelous tools, particularly the extended out breath, the Susokan, and then following Kensho, if we choose to do it so, working on the subsequent koans that allow us to deepen and broaden that insight, but also to know that this Susokan is incredibly powerful, and alone it can also bring the same kinds of results. Traditionally, the koans have been used in order to affect that in traditional cultures, but it's also possible to work with it through the Susokan, because the Susokan, in creating focus as well as expanded awareness at the same time, allows us to drop the yada yada that would interfere with our seeing clearly. And as we go more deeply, we see more clearly, and we are more let go. And even through the Susokan, awareness comes up, and we can see where we need to work, and it makes it easy to do that. So, however long you're here for in this sesshin, dive in, take it to heart, and go for it. It will be so worth it. One other thing to say about this, and that is, we all come to Zen practice with ideal notions about what it's going to do for us, and all these stories of the joy of enlightenment and the incredible experience of having Kensho and so on and so forth, which not everybody has those, lightning bolt and thunder and fireworks experiences. And whenever you do, you realize, well, of course it's this way. Then what happens as you continue practice, even before Kensho, is that you begin to see more clearly, and it can give us a misunderstanding, a misperception that we are becoming worse through the practice, when actually that's not the case. We are becoming more aware of what was always there. And so to take heart in that period we go through where it may feel pretty wretched, when we're seeing more clearly and realizing where we are caught, that allows us to little by little become free of it. There was a woman many years ago, decades ago in Rochester, who had a Kensho experience and wrote afterwards, as she came out of a sesshin when she'd had that Kensho. She said, this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. And I would have to add, if we choose to go with it. So again, thank you. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.